All right, let's go. John McWhorter, welcome back to the Glenn Show, John.
Good to be here, Glenn. How are you?
I'm fine. You are a stalwart, a pillar of the Glenn Show. It should be the Glenn and John Show. But I am Glenn Loury. I'm at Brown University. I am with the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, which sponsors the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. And I'm with John McWhorter, who's a professor at Columbia University. We sometimes call ourselves the black guys at bloggingheads.tv because we are. And we're here. So, John, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
All right, what's going on? I think a couple of things are going on that are right in our wheelhouse. One of them is that talk about reparations as a sort of policy initiative on the progressive side of the aisle has picked up of late with presidential candidates addressing themselves to the subject and pundits and so forth. This is something that both you and I have written about over the years. We ought to weigh in, I imagine. And then there's also this related issue in a way, I guess, of the exam schools in New York City, Stuyvesant, Brooklyn Tech, Bronx School of Science, and so on. Elite public high schools, which admit their students via examination vetting, and the low representation of African Americans, which was reported in the press recently, amongst those being invited to matriculate at these schools, and how that issue is discussed and what should be done about it. The mayor Mayor de Blasio has put forward some policy proposals to eliminate the examination as a means of sorting students coming into the school. Although that doesn't look like it's going anywhere politically, there's a lot of resistance to that. People have been talking about that. So I thought that those things might occupy us this hour. What do you think?
I think they will. And, you might be interested to know that Friday, I had a WBUR debate with your old friend, Sandy Darity.
Oh, did you?
I did. And,
yeah.
I think that reparations is really interesting because, the way it's being discussed now is that supposedly it's being discussed in a way that it hasn't been before. And it's one of those things that genuinely makes me realize that I have gotten to a point where I've got a certain amount of age on me. Because I think you and I both know that in the years 1999 to 2001, reparations was done to death. And the idea now seems to be that this is special because politicians are talking about it. But, to be honest, there wasn't much difference between now and the year 2000. It was on magazine covers. It was every second panel on race issues. You and I both wrote about it. I wrote 8,000 words about it in the New Republic. It was huge. If you talked about race, whether you were in a barbershop or in an Ivy League room, It was about reparations. And frankly, it was discussed. And although no big bell went off, I think the consensus was that it's an interesting idea, but that it doesn't quite go through. And now all of a sudden, because, Kamala Harris and Cory Booker and some other people, Elizabeth Warren, say something about it, it's being treated as this new issue with the new narrative being, and we have to go here at least once, that Ta-Nehisi Coates' article 5 years ago kicked off reparations being talked about in a new way. I am stunned to listen to people, and not all of them are 30, saying that it used to be a taboo topic. It was not taboo.
Hold on just a minute, John. Let me interject a couple of things. First, I want people to know that Sandy Darity, William A. Darity, a professor of economics at Duke, and a colleague of mine from graduate school back in the 1970s at MIT, has a long-standing position in arguing in favor of reparations, and it's significant that you were debating with him. Secondly, you're referring, I think, in part to the buzz, and it was more than buzz, that was engendered by Randall Robinson's book, The Debt. Which was a full-throated, passionate Jeremiad on behalf of the position that African Americans were due just recompense for
national bestseller.
Our ancestors have been treated, and it engendered a lot of discussion. So no, reparations is not new. But go on. I mean, you were setting the stage admirably. I just wanted to add a couple of facts.
Well, I think that I learned something from the debate with Darity and some of the social media response to it. I think for you and I to be addressing this on the terms that I think it's going to be addressed for these 10 minutes when reparations is going to go around again. I think we need to understand the new idea is that we must focus on the concept of wealth. And so I think we're going to waste our time if we talk about how do you decide who's black, if it's going to be about individual checks. And if you're going to give this money to organizations, which would the organizations be and what would they do? I think that all of that is so obvious at this point, and maybe the fact that we figured it out 20 years ago has something to do with it. That now the new stratagem, and it is a stratagem, is you have to talk about wealth, and wealth is a word with a certain glow around it. And so the idea is that black people on the aggregate have much, much less wealth accumulated than white people. The reason for that lesser accumulation of wealth is slavery, Jim Crow, and redlining. Not just slavery, but things that were going on as recently as 50 years ago, some people would say even now. And that what we need to do is, and then here, let's use this word, redress this issue of wealth. Now, what I accused Darity of the other day, and I even pushed a little harder than I normally would because I just thought this is important, is that the typical spiel now is going to be to talk about wealth gaps. And everybody's going to nod. But what the idea is that black people should have money pumped into their bank accounts to make up for this wealth gap because the wealth gap is not our fault. Now, I think that people like Darity are going for a strategy. I don't know if this is conscious or not. The idea being that first you talk about wealth and the resonance of that word and the injustice, and you talk about history. And then at some point, we have softened white America up enough to say, therefore, transfer funds into our accounts. But I think what you have to evaluate, and you know better than me, you're an economist, is that a good idea that everybody who's black, even if we could figure out what that was, Darity has a formula, everybody who's black gets money put into their bank accounts to make up for that wealth gap, and then we move on. Is that a good idea?
Yeah, we're going to have ample opportunity to kick this around. No is my bottom line answer, although I'd like to, say a little bit more about exactly why, and we'll do in due course. I want to observe that I think the attractiveness of the wealth framing is that it's, people get resources passed across generations from their forebears. They inherit property, they get inheritances, they get a leg up in life, help with the down payment on their first house, college education paid for without debt, and so on. And it's the past visiting itself in our midst. I mean, I think that's what wealth symbolizes. Wealth symbolizes previous generation status influencing opportunities for those of us alive today. So the racial wealth gap is, in a way, a congealed representation of the history of Black dispossession, or at least it fits very, very neatly with such a worldview. I mean, if I pointed out that much wealth is generated within the lifetime of the people who possess it by the initiatives and endeavors that they undertake, that is starting businesses, being successful in their professions or whatever, that very few people are walking around with inheritances or trust funds or whatever. And even those who do get a leg up may mainly be responsible for what it is that they've done with whatever little head start that they may have gotten. And that racial disparities in wealth reflect not just the past, but they also reflect the present. Then I would, I think, be running afoul of the narrative. But I think the reason that wealth is so important, and I should say that Darity and his colleagues have done a lot of work in terms of trying to develop a factual basis for assessing wealth differences. So when you hear a statistic like the typical African American has 1/10 or 1/50th the wealth of the typical white American, you will be hearing a statistic that is probably derived from some of the research that Darity and company have done. They do surveys of populations. They calculate the median wealth holder, and then they do racial comparisons at the median. Of course, most people, or a great number of people, don't have any wealth or have a negative net worth because they're in debt. They're paying off their mortgages, their credit card and whatnot. So you could raise some statistical questions about whether or not I'm getting an accurate picture of the populations by taking the 50th percentile, that is the median wealth holder, and comparing them across racial groups. But it's an industry. Now, what do I think? I don't think you can discount the influence of Ta-Nehisi Coates' article in The Atlantic from 5 or 6 years ago, The Case for Reparations. It had a huge impact in the media at the time, and it's given his subsequent fame with Between the World and Me and all of that, enjoyed a second life. It's included as one of the essays in his collection.
The direct
We Were 8 Years in Power. And so it's helped to frame the discussion. I'll say one more thing and turn it back over to you. I think the reason that we're talking about reparations is because people are out of ideas. They don't know what to say about racial disparities other than to point a finger and then to try to create a kind of a political issue. I think we're talking about reparations because the Democratic primary season has begun. People are looking at South Carolina. They're looking at James Clyburn. They're looking at how the blacks are going to vote. And, that's the early primary thing that will make a difference in terms of how people's candidacies are faring. And they want to appeal to African-American votes. So they're pandering by raising this issue. But there's a lot more to say about this.
Yeah, it's I think overall it's become a new way of being woke, of saying that you feel Black people's pain, to say we need to talk about reparations. And you don't have to specify what you mean by talk about. You don't have to think about all of the obstacles to reparations that there would be, of which political would be only one of a great many. You don't have to be specific. You just say, we need to talk about reparations, and everybody claps. And it's kind of like saying we need to have a conversation about race, or nobody wants to talk about race in this country. These various kind of catchphrases that have a very approximate correspondence to empirical reality. You just kind of say it. And I don't hate Elizabeth Warren for mouthing that sentence. Yes, she's a politician. She has to say that. But, it's one of those things that will get us a place where we've gone so often before. And Coleman Hughes has, as usual, been extremely articulate about this in his last piece in Quillette about reparations, which is that the question becomes, and I think somebody like Darity or somebody like Coates thinks, if there are these wealth disparities, then it must be directly linkable to these ills of the past, even the recent past. Whereas I think you and I are immediately thinking, no, the complexities of social history and race in the United States are such that those wealth gaps today are due equally much to cultural patterns, yes, culture, that have settled in, often as the result of racism, but take on a life of their own, and make it so that it's impossible to say that the wealth gap is anything near all due to redlining, Jim Crow, or slavery. And so, as I often say, boys are shooting themselves. Well, in a way, boys are shooting each other over sneakers every summer in big cities across the United States. It's very hard to say that they're doing that because of racism. And whatever the reason is that you have that epidemic every summer. Is it really that those boys are killing one another or stanching one another's life chances because of redlining and Jim Crow and slavery? The line of argument would be so indirect. And the reason is not that they're sociopaths, but these things are complex. It's hard to make the argument. The thing is, though, Glenn, that no one's going to listen to that. You and I know that the reason for the wealth gap today is as much because of these unintended cultural patterns that settle in, notions of what it means to be a Black person, et cetera, especially things that settle in when you're young and then just sit. It's as due as much to that as to the ills of the past. But our view on that is going to remain a minority view in terms of what somebody like Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren is going to say. And so I find myself thinking, and I'm almost done, on reparations this time, I'm thinking it'd be one thing for me to dig in my heels and just insist on saying the things I said in 2001, all of which I mean. But on the other hand, we're in a real world, we're in a real society where people are going to keep on saying there's a wealth gap, let's fill it in, let's fill it in. And I find myself thinking, might it not be useful to be flexible, take a deep breath and say, okay, yes. And it's funny, Charles Krauthammer made an argument like this for very cynical reasons, but just say, yes, pump the money in. It's interesting. I'm imagining, I think I'm black, so I guess I would get all this money that I didn't earn. I can't say I would complain, but yeah, then there are black people who really need it. So all this money. And maybe we would also set up poor black people who haven't ever had that much money before to know how to do something with it, because a lot of them would understandably not know. And then maybe that's it. The idea being, okay, the reparations were granted and there you go. But my problem, and I'm done, is that I know in my gut, just like I knew about Brett Kavanaugh, ha ha ha. But in this case, yes, I'm going with my gut. It wouldn't be over. If we did that here, all the same people would be just as mad. And they would all be saying reparations is just a beginning, not an end. And there'd be all these smart pieces written by the younger people with 3 names about how it's quote unquote problematic to think that you can make up for 400 years with payments. It wouldn't be the end. And so I'm not sure why we should even do it when we both know that the frame of mind that leads to this call for reparations is an emotion and an identity rather than a political program, and that nothing will ever make those people feel like both shoes have dropped. What do you think?
I think a number of things. I like this point at the end about how it's not a political program, and I want to come back to that because it's not. I want to make a couple of observations. What defenders of the reparations advocacy would say would be, we're not just asking for cash. That's a trivialization of the claim that we're making. We don't expect a check to be mailed out to every African American. We're asking for, and then there'll be a laundry list, money going to scholarships for kids to go to college, or, hyping up investment in African American communities so that they have more opportunity, more jobs, or whatever. So they'll say that. What the politicians are going to say is, I'm not saying do reparations, I'm saying study it. They're going to get behind the legislation that the former Congressman John Conyers from Detroit would introduce in every session of Congress. And he was there for a long time. It would never get out of committee, but he would always come up with the idea the commission should be impaneled to study the idea of reparations. So they'll say, I'm not saying do it, I'm just saying study it, I'm saying take it seriously. So I just wanted to put those things as caveats. I think I have a couple of conceptual points that I want to make. What about groups that have a lot of wealth? Okay, if you're going to talk about a wealth gap, let's talk about all the wealth gaps. What about the Jews? Let's look at who's a billionaire in this country. Okay, if I see an overrepresentation of some group amongst the billionaires, what does that tell me? Does it tell me that they were lucky? Does it tell me that their ancestors were corrupt? Do they have their wealth because they stole it from somebody? Is wealth a zero-sum game? You got it, I don't have it. It's because you took it from me or your ancestors took it from my ancestors. So if we're going to have a discussion about wealth, let's put all the cards on the table. What about people who've got a lot of it? Are they entitled to it? Did their group do something wrong to get it, et cetera? The other thing I want to say is I find this focus on wealth really very interesting because the same people who are talking about the wealth gap between the races would be against the Republicans who want to get rid of the inheritance tax. And yet, conceptually, they're on the same side of the argument. Namely, I'm entitled to the benefits that my ancestors generated, some of whom were robbed of that benefit, but it was my property, my entitlement. So when a farmer in Kansas says, I want to be able to hand my land over to my son so that he can continue to farm it, or a small business person in Cincinnati says, I've got a shop on the corner, it's worth $10 million, and I want that to go to my children. Get out of here with your 60% or your 30% tax on my inheritance. They're making, in a way, the same kind of claim that a person who says, my ancestors were enslaved, you owe me something because they never got the fruits of their labor. They're saying they're entitled to the benefit of a previous generation's work, not something you did, something your ancestors did. And to the extent that that's a valid claim, the people who say that they want to be able to pass their wealth on without federal taxation to their progeny are also making the same kind of claim. So those are some things, but, I said this recently in talking with, I think it was Robert Cherry a couple of weeks ago in a previous Glenn Show post. This is a terrible idea, not only because it's impractical, or politic. I don't know how you're going to get 50.1% of the country to agree to this as a matter of policy. It's a terrible idea because it frames the moral claims that African Americans legitimately have on the country in the wrong way. It commodifies something that shouldn't be commodified. It turns it into a quid pro quo. It makes it a negotiation between population aggregates, the blacks on one side of the aisle, everybody else on the other side of the aisle, talking about transfers, when in fact, what we should be doing is building political coalitions and advocating for progressive policies that lift everybody in the country, not just making racial claims. The idea that you could discharge this obligation. So we have these massive ghettos in which millions of people live with less opportunity. The schools don't work. The streets are violent. There aren't any jobs. There's a lot of poverty. Kids are in gangs. There's a terrible amount of homicide that's going on. So we have serious problems. And we're going to talk about the underrepresentation of African Americans at the upper end of the educational hierarchy in a moment. We have serious issues in terms of African American disadvantage. The idea that this is a debt that can be paid is a terrible, terrible idea. Suppose it were to succeed and you were to get payment. I don't know what the number would be, $25,000 a head, $50,000, $25,000, $50,000, you're already up in the many hundreds of billions of dollars, but let's suppose it was something like that. The idea that you'd say to the country, look, you owe us something, and then you get paid. Now, people are done. Now you've been paid. You don't have any more claim. When the incarceration rate amongst African Americans is higher by a factor, order of magnitude, when the school failure rates, when the unemployment rates, when the poverty rates and so forth persist, because they are going to persist, the basis for you to be able to command the country's attention to address those problems has been eviscerated because you've commodified it and you've taken the money. So that to me is one thing, but it also, it seems to me, conceives of the country not as we are all in this together, all being Americans obligated to one another because of our national obligations and so forth. It makes us into these identity groups and then puts us on one or the other side of a bargaining table. And then we're up there striking a bargain. I can see no justification for dealing with the problems of the Black poor, specifically as Black people, without dealing with the problems of the poor. I don't see how a white person in, I don't know, Eastern Kentucky or Southwestern Ohio or whatever, can be expected to shoulder a burden that's directed toward alleviating Black suffering when they're suffering too. And I don't understand why we as African Americans should want that. So, I mean, that's the kind of argument I try to make.
This is tough. This is tough stuff. I mean, I think, let's say I'm imagining 50,000. Everybody gets $50,000, even 100. What would that really solve in terms of what a lot of the problems are? And it's funny, impressions matter. And it's funny that people on the left are allowed to tell stories, and that's considered reportage. If you and I tell a story, it's just an anecdote. That's not fair. Stories are valid on both sides. And I find myself thinking of just where I ate Saturday night. Yes, where I ate. City Island is part of the Bronx, and it's where you go if you want, seafood in New York. And you go up to City Island, and there are probably about 20 very ordinary seafood restaurants where you can get your lobster, you can get your shrimp or your whatever. That's how we do this in New York. And because it's near the Bronx, you go up to City Island, and it's not, you can go to a restaurant like the one I went to. It's not mostly, working class white people the way it would have been back in the day. Actually, most of the people at this restaurant, although it was staffed mostly by Latinos, that's the nature of the economy. I'm sure that it was created by Italian whites back in the day. Most of the people there were Black, and they were not Caribbean, except for one couple I saw. Black American people eating this food. And they were not any kind of Black elite. There was lots of heavy Ebonics, all sorts of things. These were, what a certain kind of person would call real Black people. And they're sitting there, and they're at this restaurant. This is seafood. It's not cheap. Frankly, the place is vastly overpriced. And yet one Black family after another walked in, and not just having birthday parties, they could afford it. I doubt if they eat there every week, They can afford it. Now, of course, this is just one night. This is just some black people. But I was thinking this is a restaurant that probably stays open because of black people wanting to come in and eat a lot of shrimp and crab. And I thought, these people are representative too. They're not rare. And yet we're supposed to think that the black community in some default sense is these paupers. And if Donald Trump describes the black community as basically one big fat inner city with just a few exceptions, then everybody black is up in arms and calling him stereotyping. And people who grew up in the ghetto talk about what a coherent and ultimately loving place it was. People who didn't grow up in the ghetto start talking about how their neighborhood kind of was a ghetto. I even saw that. I grew up in Mount Airy, Germantown, and Philadelphia, and a few of my black friends of my age who grew up in Germantown, student from Mount Airy, Germantown, grew up in lovely, stony, treesy Germantown, but in the neighborhoods that were not as shiny as some others. So, well, I grew up in the ghetto, and I remember thinking, such and such, you did not grow up in any ghetto, because I visited your house every second weekend all summer in 1977. That sort of thing. And yet here are these people, and I'm just thinking, really? Do these people need $50,000 extra dollars? And given that I was not looking at some rare elite, I just couldn't help thinking, what is the basis of these calculations to depict black people as so weak and broken? Yes, the statistics must be correct. I agree. It would be surprising if there weren't those disparities. But is it really such that we need checks? Whereas, like you say, the J.D. Vance people, the hillbilly elegy people, they don't deserve checks because their ancestors came here on their own initiative. And so the idea is, and it's funny, the reception of that book. With J.D. Vance's book, everybody is very open to the idea that culture played a part, that the economy has not been great to Appalachians, but then there were behavioral issues that Vance very carefully describes. There's been some pushback from his community about that, but still respectable reviews from, quote unquote, respectable people say, yes, it's partly that the economy has made the people behave in a certain way, and so assigning blame is difficult. But somehow when black people are in the same situation, those acceptable people have to say that it's all the economy. And that's where this reparations thing is coming from. And it's such oversimplified social history, so condescending to, frankly, most black people. And yet we must take this seriously, because I don't think it's going to be going away. But those black people at the Lobster Shack, and that is where it was, and I dare anybody who thinks that I'm wrong to tell me that I'm wrong. Anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about, go to the Lobster Shack on City Island. I had a lovely meal. So Lobster Shack, if you hear that I've said this, well, I'm sending you some business. But notice that there are no white people around you, that it's black people from the Bronx who eat the Lobster Shack. And frankly, you cannot inhale in there without spending $125. And those people are quite ordinary. They're just middle-class black people. I think that we need to rethink. And Glenn, I think, I'm the one who usually says at this point, no one's going to listen to us. Maybe they will. I don't know.
Well, I'm waiting for one of these Democratic candidates, more centrist type of Amy Klobuchar, somebody like that, to figure out that there's an opportunity here to come out and to say, Amy, by the way, Amy, I'm available. Okay, Glenn Loury, I'm happy to fly out to fly down to DC and meet with you and your staff and help you all craft this strategy. To say, look, I think racism is a terrible thing. I think that many crimes have been committed against African Americans over the course of American history. These things are lamentable. I also think that we have made significant strides toward trying to redress some of these problems, and then you could enumerate. But I agree, obstacles remain. Opportunity is not equal. There is work to be done. However, I think that the idea of paying reparations to African Americans for the crimes committed against their ancestors is a terrible idea, and here's why, and to say why. I want every African American vote, but I am not willing to pander to you. I am not going to treat you like you are children. I'm not going to say things that I don't believe, and I'm not going to advocate things that I think are bad for our country. We're 350 million people here. 10% of us are black, but 90% of us are not. We're going to have to get through whatever the challenges are that we face together. To say the kind of things that Barack Obama might have said if he would have been true to his 2008 sales job. I'm not black, I'm not white, I'm America, it's in my very DNA, there's not, whatever. And to say it without apology. I'm not pandering. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to practice the soft bigotry of low expectations. I expect citizenship from you, just like I expect it from everybody else. Let's make this a better country for everybody. Let's not divide ourselves. I'll stop, but you see where I'm going. Do you think that's possible? Do you think that somebody is going to be brave enough to take a counter narrative into the Democratic presidential primary season and ask Black people for their votes by treating us like we're grown-up adult American citizens and not like we're whiny little brats who have to be, placated?
No.
In a word.
They should, but they're trying to get elected. And they don't have time for these nigglings. Most of the people in question know what we're talking about. Beto O'Rourke probably, I'm just guessing that he's knee deep in the pieties, and so he would be beyond any constructive engagement on this sort of thing. Cory Booker.
Let me just mention, excuse me, John, for interrupting. Beto O'Rourke recently, being interviewed by somebody, mentioned Derek Hamilton. Derek Hamilton is an African-American economist and a colleague of Sandy Darity's. He was asked by one of the news people on the Sunday show, I think it might have been Chuck Todd, what are you reading? And he was stymied by that question. Every politician should have a pat answer to that question.
He couldn't even fake it.
What are your 3 books? No, he said the Odyssey. Johnny's reading Homer. And then he said he was reading some papers by Derek Hamilton talking about the wealth gap. I forgive me for interrupting, but I just wanted to, that's where we are. Okay, that's where
there you go. And that actually says it. Yeah, that's all of them. I think deep down, Cory Booker understands the truth, if I may so arrogantly call it the truth. You can't have been the mayor of Newark and not have seen it. And I know him a tiny, tiny bit. But, the baby bonds is a great way of triangulating. There's no way that he can afford to admit anything that he really knows about this sort of thing in public. So no, the politicians know, but it would be nice if once whoever gets in, and I really hope somebody gets in who's not the current person, that the whole reparations idea does not actually become the way this person discusses race. There's so many things that could be done, including the baby bonds, but this notion of the checks just doesn't work. And I find myself thinking of, this is the one where McWhorter tells stories. And maybe this story is too old, but I remember when I lived in Lawnside, New Jersey, middle class for the most part, all Black town. A lot of people don't know that about me. I spent the second half of my childhood in an all Black town. All Black. Like there were 2 white people and nobody knew who they were. All Black town. I live in a very upper middle class development in it called Warwick Hills. And I'm not going to be any more specific than that, but I had a next door neighbor, and this was almost like a laboratory experiment. My next door neighbor and he and I were the same age. We looked so much alike that from a distance, people would call our respective names. Physically, we were the same person. Now, his parents were not as educated as my parents. His parents, however, had more money than my parents. They had the manicured lawn. They're living, what was soon to become the Cosby ideal, except in very suburban New Jersey. I'm going to call the kid Clarence. And if I say any name other than Clarence, Blogging Heads editors, please bleep it out because I don't want this person's business to be spread. But Clarence, would, be out very late. All of his friends would, congregate around his garage. So I'm being the nerd that I am and doing what I did. All of his friends. And, the friends are the kind of swaggering type. Remember, this is an all Black town. Kind of the swaggering type. I think everybody's parents were probably of working class origins, and now everybody has enough money to be middle class. Great, wonderful. They didn't like me. I was too a little Urkel, little effeminate, so I wasn't part of their crowd. But they would be in there late. And by the time we got to about 12, 13, 14, real late. And so it's getting to the point where I'm up late enough in my room to hear it. And it's like 11, 12, 1, and especially as people start driving, cars are going in and out and in and out at this guy's garage.
Uh-oh.
And I was so naive that it took me a long time to pick up on it. And I imagine he was telling his parents that he was just chilling with his homies, as it would have been put back then. But Clarence with dealing drugs from his garage, not just a little weed on the playground. He had a drugstore, and that's what he was doing. And Clarence went to fucking jail. Now, I don't know what happened to him, but I can guarantee you not much. And frankly, I've looked him up. Not much. He went to jail. Now, the question is, why was he running a drugstore when his parents made more money than mine? He had more opportunity. We looked the same. We were the same person. We had the same opportunity. Clarence had a black identity. That was his way of being cool. Were there white kids doing the same thing? Yes, sort of, especially dealing the weed in the schoolyard.
Yeah.
But doing it from the garage to the point that he had a whole shelf of narcotics there and that he was drug central. He did that partly because that's what a black kid did. He thought it was cool. And I knew him well enough to know that was part of it. He thought that was cool. Now, is the fact that he today probably works at a Staples due to redlining? Because he escaped the redlining. We were exactly the generation that escaped that. Good for him. Now, is he weird? The thing is, no. There are cultural issues involved here as well that have to be addressed. Now, I'm almost done, but I'm very close to them. The only thing that worries me about that anecdote is that I am talking about 1979, 1980. A lot can change in 2 or 3 generations, but I don't know if that story is so rare today. There are Clarences all over New York City. And it worries me, and I don't think reparations is the solution to Clarences. But then, of course, Glenn, anybody listening to this beyond a certain crowd is thinking that he's just a little story. I don't think he's just a little story.
Do you remember, I can't think of the name of this book, but the storyline was there were 2 brothers, African-American from one of the boroughs in New York City. And they had gotten themselves somehow to the Ivy League through a prep school that had been recruiting inner city kids. And one of the brothers, one of the brothers ended up at the end of the day getting shot dead by a police officer. An undercover police officer, because they thought he was a homeless man and they were trying to rob him. And that was something that they were doing. They were going around robbing or beating up. Maybe it wasn't robbery. Maybe it was just harassment and assault. But in any case, they were messing with these people on the street, and they happened on the wrong guy. He was an armed police officer who ended up shooting one of the brothers dead. And then there was either New York Times Magazine piece or some big spread in the Atlantic or something about this family, about these kids. And then a journalist wrote a book about it. It was, at the end of the day, the heartbreaking core of the story was these guys who had a pathway into the American upper middle class laid out in front of them like a yellow brick road felt that they were more authentically Black in virtue of the fact that they were engaged in this gangster kind of activity. They were trying to hold on to some sense of identity and credibility with their peers, even in the face of this transition that was going on in terms of their class status because of the educational opportunities that they had. And it was just a tragic, heartbreaking story, and it's indicative of, I think, a little bit of the story that you were just telling in terms of the culture angle. I also want to call to the listeners' attention here Thomas Chatterton Williams' fine book, "Losing My Cool," which is not about running a drugstore out of your garage, but it is about suburban New Jersey, and it is about being Black and trying to figure out what it means to be a human being and how your Blackness might get in the way of the things that you need, how a certain trivial view about what it means to be Black, a certain infantile and stilted and narrow-minded view about what it means to be Black. I have to listen to hip hop. I got to dress a certain way. I got to be involved with certain kinds of shady activities and whatnot, could inhibit your full development as a human being. So anyway, I just wanted to mention those things.
And I think just to add, Orlando Patterson, when he writes about the cool pose culture, and a certain kind of person lights into him as stereotyping, but no, that's real. That cool pose culture is real. Mary Patillo McCoy, or is it Mary McCoy Patillo, has written articulately about that. And she is not a conservative or friend to conservatives, but she says there's a thin line between the thug pose and actually becoming a thug. And there's an issue there because I think many people would agree a white kid can pose as a thug, can take on certain attitudes, but still kind of hold it down. There's a temptation among brown kids often to go further than that out of a sense of identity. And none of that means that these are bad people, but it does question the idea that the fact that they're going to go on and represent a wealth gap as they get older is all due to redlining and Jim Crow and slavery. The argument is just so fraught. And so it really does put us in a weird place. But the problem is that if we say this, we're told that we're just telling anecdotes, which isn't fair. If Ta-Nehisi Coates can talk about his supposed friend Prince Jones, and that's supposed to represent the entire Black experience, fine, okay. He's telling a story. He tells it well, okay. But that means we can tell stories too. And so Clarence is not just a story. The Lobster Shack is not just a story. Talk about critical race theory. These are stories that represent a larger reality, unless you and I are somehow not real, and enough said. So yeah, these things are, this stuff is tough, but I'm not with this new reparations idea. I think people are genuflecting like they're in church. I don't think most people are really thinking about what it would entail. I don't think most people are really thinking about political reality. If the politicians want to use the word reparations because it'll get them Black votes, good. Go on. I would do that too. But in terms of really pretending this is politics, everybody read The Debt. The Debt was the Between the World and Me of the year 1999. It was the new Jim Crow of 1999. Anybody interested in race read that book. We've been through this, and it didn't pan out, not because everybody's a racist, but because it's a charismatic, but as you say, impolitic and impractical idea. I think we just need to move on and actually help Black people who need help in a way that can actually bear fruition. And not just because it wouldn't ever work politically, but because I don't think it would work practically. It's a tough issue.
Okay, that's reparations. I think a terrible idea for the country, not just in practical and in politics, but framing the issues before us, which are serious issues of social morality, in exactly the wrong way, pitting one group of Americans against another in terms of their race, making claims on the public fisc in terms of racial entitlement and so on. But I want to talk a little bit, if we've got time, about. Pardon?
I love learning the word fisc. What's that?
Yeah, FISC, as in fiscal.
That's a word?
Yeah, man. You got to go to graduate school in economics to learn that word. The public fisc, FISC.
I learned the word.
Okay. Listen, let's talk a little bit about the exam school problem in New York City. You're right there in the midst of it all. What's going on? What do you think? Oh, let me just set the stage. Stuyvesant High School accepted 895 new students in this class that's coming in the fall. The freshman class at the Stuyvesant High School out of, I don't know how many, we're trying to get it, 30,000 or something like that. And only 7 of them were Black.
Yep.
Less than 1%.
It's like none, basically. Yeah.
The New York Times has actually been running stories where they interviewed a handful of Black kids who are going to Stuyvesant. What's it like to be Black at Stuyvesant? And the way that the media, the liberal media, are framing the problem is, oh my God, segregated high schools that are not diverse and representative of the city. They'll point out that Black and Latino students are a third or something like that of the students in the public schools in New York City, and they're only 1% or 2% of the students who have been admitted to this exam school. It's a scandal. Obviously, something must be done. Let's get rid of the exam, so on and so on. Oh, by the way, and I'll stop, Asian students are like a third or half or even greater of the number coming into these very elite schools, even though they're less than, 20% or even 10% of the New York City overall student population. So what's being said about that in the Tony cocktail parties that you attend in New York City amongst the cognoscenti?
Well, I don't go to those parties much anymore, but if I were at one, I wouldn't bring this up unless it was the kind of party that's becoming increasingly common, where the sort of people who write for or read Quillette, it really is becoming, I put this social history down here, there's a social agglomeration abloom in terms of parties, small get-togethers. There's something happening here in New York City where people of that mind get together. Haven't been in one of those in about 3 months. And no, I wouldn't bring it up in among good thinking people, because all you would get is these pieties, and I'd rather talk about, new TV shows. But the problem is this, it just comes down to this. Why are Black kids having trouble passing the test? You're not supposed to ask that question. And so you imply that there's something racist about the admittance procedure. There's something racist about society that prevents Black kids from being able to
They can't afford the test prep course. It costs thousands of dollars to go to the test prep program, and they can't afford it. That's what they're going to
Now, of course, if you read between the lines, over the past 8 years, there's been free test prep available for poor kids because New York does work sometimes. And this is, if you read between the lines of the latest reports, that hasn't made any difference. I have never read anywhere that the free test prep is not as good as test prep that costs money. I imagine that's the next argument. Haven't read that, but there is free test prep because some people are human in terms of trying to solve problems like this. And yet it hasn't made any difference. From an article I read 5 years ago, people don't even use that test prep. Now you could say that there's some people who feel that there would just be no point in even trying, but then there's the question, why the fear of the tests? And then there's the fact that there's been a massive drop-off since the early 90s. It wasn't always like that with these schools. And it's funny, I've always been slightly perplexed inside at these numbers because I lived in New York in the late 80s. And I had some friends of humble origins of color who went to those schools. And I never heard about there being any major issue. And I've learned now that issue started after I moved to California. And apparently the reason for that is not that society got more racist, but that schools in New York stopped using tracking, and that therefore kids of humble circumstances who were of promise stopped being put in special programs where they could learn from each other and acquire the kinds of skills that make you good at those tests. And so it's hard to say that it's racism, given that knocking off tracking was supposed to be anti-racist last time I checked. The idea was to help the kids on the bottom by exposing them to the smarts of the kids on the top and in the middle. And so it just comes down to, why can't Black kids pass the test?
Okay, why can't they?
I'm done. If you're not going to ask that question, then you're engaging in piety, and that's what all this coverage is.
But I want to ask the question of you. Why do you think they can't?
Well, I think that, as we've talked about, I think that those tests are a very peculiar skill. It's a very peculiar way of being asked what you know about something, of having your intelligence checked. And if you don't grow up steeped in it, for one thing, such as if you don't, you aren't tracked into programs where you're going to be exposed to it, then to all of a sudden have to learn how to do it when you're 16 and a half or 17, it's rather late. And I also do firmly believe, and I've written about this in a couple of articles too, and we've talked about it, I think that there is something about the upbringing that you have as a brown person that discourages that kind of fill in the bubble, abstract question thinking. And that doesn't mean that you're dumb. It's a very peculiar kind of question asking. Most human beings in the world are not used to being asked direct questions. That's not a normal way for Homo sapiens to communicate, direct, disembodied questions. You learn how to deal with being asked, is grandma taller than grandpa, or what's the capital of Minneapolis, or how long do you think you could hold your breath? That's not normal human interaction. You need practice with that. And working class people in general are not as natural at it as middle class kids. Middle class kids get more practice in it because of schooling. And I think that Black people end up suffering the brunt of that, such that very often in my life, I've known whipped, smart, very bright Black students in college who are really lousy on tests. Sometimes I've said, such and such, how are your GREs? And they're abysmal. You would never know it from what this person is like in terms of their academic and mental performance, but they are no good at those tests. And there's something about, it's partly class. You see it with white kids when it comes to class. And then with Black kids, in my experience, it continues even when the economics have changed. And I don't know if we as a society are prepared to actually face head on an inconvenient fact like that. And so we end up having to be pious.
Okay, we're going to have something to disagree about, because I don't think I agree with what you're saying here on the
No.
test. Well, first of all, I want to observe that a lot of these kids who are of second generation foreign-born parents who aren't middle class, they're working class or lower, including many of the Asian kids who are doing well on these tests. So, I just wanted to observe that. Secondly, I wanted to say, as a person who teaches, I'm in an Ivy League university and I teach graduate students. So this is not the same as kids trying to get into a high school. And I'll come back to this distinction. But what I've noticed is that graduate students who do well on the GRE math questions, where they have to fill in the bubbles to answer the questions, are able to follow my arguments and lectures when I'm using calculus and linear algebra and probability theory and statistics and mathematical analysis much more closely and effectively than students who do poorly on the test. In other words, in my experience, that particular test, I'm talking about graduate education and I'm talking about the graduate record examination, does a reasonably decent job of identifying people who are going to be able to perform well in the classroom when it comes time to follow intricate analytical argumentation that makes use of mathematics. Now, I don't know if that's true at the high school entry level. If it's not true, they shouldn't be using that test. In other words, the proof of the pudding should be in the eating. The proof of the validity of the test should be the extent to which it accurately forecasts the post-admissions performance of the people who take it. Now, this is something that can be ascertained. You can do a statistical study where you look at a sample of people, you look at how they did on the test, you look at how they do in the school, and you see the extent to which the test is an accurate predictor of how they're going to do. And if it's not an accurate predictor, and it has a disparate incidence in terms of who's able to do well on it, then you should consider abandoning it. Now, my sense of the matter is that that's not the case. And yet that is to say that no one has demonstrated or maybe even effectively argued that there's no correlation between doing well on the test on the one hand and doing well in the school after you get admitted on the other. If so, I would be prepared to revise my view. But poverty doesn't explain African Americans doing poorly on the test, because a lot of poor people who are not Black do well on the test. And the test is not a bad thing just because it has bubbles or asks you to answer abstract questions that most people don't encounter in ordinary life. The test would be a bad thing if it failed to accurately forecast who was going to do well once they were admitted to the school.
Well, okay, yeah, and I'm forgetting to mention something, which is, you're absolutely right. And yeah, there are even places I don't feel like going. I think the good thinking way of putting it would be fear. I think the way I would really put it is that subliminally, a lot of Black families just think that's not what we do. Yes, the Korean immigrant's kid, the parents make that Korean kid learn how to do those damn tests, hell or high water. That is clearly not happening with Black kids. It is much less likely that the Black parent is going to say, you must learn how to handle that test. It's the only way you're going to get into Stuyvesant. And there you go. And I think that there's just a sense that, well, there are other things that we prioritize. Maybe it isn't that big a deal that our kid doesn't get into Stuyvesant. All of that is unsurprising given the history of Black America. But still, it means that the reason that there's so few Black kids in Stuyvesant is not that society doesn't want them to be there. And what's interesting is that with this solution that de Blasio is proposing, you get rid of the test, or you have a special segment of those admitted who were admitted because they're tops in their school, but not tops in terms of the test. All of that would create exactly what the Black kids lost my sentence. Exactly what Black kids in elite institutions always complain about, which is that there would always be a suspicion that Black kids got in for the wrong reason. And it's an interesting irony. Jamel Bowie, and I should say Jamel, when he does something other than race, he is good. I was listening to him on NPR a few weeks ago. He was talking about the Electoral College. My heart swelled. I thought to myself, he is a Black person. He's talking about something that is not race related. I mean, except that the Electoral College were aggrieved because of Trump, and he's probably most aggrieved about Trump because of race. But still, he's arguing political theory. He was whip smart, and I thought, thank God that man is on the New York Times page. Frankly,
by the way, we ought to discuss the Electoral College sometime, because I don't think you and I agree about that either. But go ahead.
I would like to. But Bowie, when he's on race, I think I never agree with him. And Bowie and a few other people, Aisha Harris and some other people, had a whole conversation, I think at Slate, about what it's like to be Black on an elite campus and how everybody thinks that you got in because of affirmative action. Well, okay, if you don't like it, then why in the world would you support policies at New York's elite public schools where everybody would think that the Black kids got in through standards that are different from everybody else's? And that's what I mean by the idea that the way we talk about race is just based on this religious feeling rather than really grappling with the realities of the world we live in. If you don't like people thinking that you got in because of affirmative action, well, do you think that no Black kids got in because of affirmative action? Because you know that quite a few, if not all of them, did. So are you saying that you're better than the ones who didn't? Well, because if you think affirmative action is so wonderful, then why do you think it's so bad when people think you got in because of affirmative action? All of that makes no sense whatsoever, and nobody in official positions questions it. But this business of New York's elite schools being better if we have that kind of affirmative action where the black kids are going to look like they don't deserve to be there. And then you have articles in 5 years where the black kids are all sitting on the stairway being photographed and talking about how everybody thinks they got in according to lowered standards when frankly they did. This is a worthless discussion. I think we need to talk about why the black kids aren't taking the test and why they aren't good at it and how we can make them good at it. That's all.
I agree with that. We need to stick with the test, and we need to make sure that our kids, African American kids, perform better on it. But I wanted to say something because I think it's actually worse than the halo effect, the negative halo effect. Oh, there's affirmative action. You're black. You must have benefited from it. I think if you actually put a substantial number of African American students who would not have done very well on the test into a place like Stuyvesant, and you put them in there with these other kids who were off the charts. I mean, we're not talking about the top half. We're not talking about the top 10%. We're talking about the top 1%, okay? And then we're in a physics classroom, or we're in a calculus classroom, or we're in a chemistry classroom, or we're in an American history classroom where the teacher expects that you read 3 chapters in the book and understood everything in it last night, okay? These kids are not going to perform very well in those classrooms. Okay, they're just not. So the reality is going to be, you're going to be talking about remediation. The next thing you're going to be talking about is how come the school doesn't have a program to bring these kids up to speed? The reality is they're going to be implicit tracks. If they don't explicitly track, then they're going to be implicit or tacit tracking going on, where everybody knows that a certain proportion, the intellectual lumpen proletariat, are not going to be with it. They're not going to be getting into Harvard at the end of the day, and they're not going to, et cetera. And that's going to be like a dirty little secret. Or worse, you're going to undermine the standards of excellence in the institution by dumbing down what's being done there so as not to expose the lack of preparation of the youngsters who have come from the underrepresented minority group. This is a disaster. This leads to the kind of thing that Amy Wax got into trouble for when she commented about African-American students at the University of Pennsylvania Law School clustering near the bottom of the class. I happen not to know whether that's true or false about the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and I'm not making any claim one way or the other about it, but I'm just saying, if true, how horrible would it be? And I'm saying, likely to be true at an elite, high pressure, high performance exam school if you use different standards for admitting the black kids as you're using for everybody else.
You know, in sum, I would say about Stuyvesant, this is, I guess the theme of this episode is anecdotes. I used to live in Jersey City, which in terms of transit is close to Stuyvesant. And so my life used to regularly take me by where Stuyvesant is, where the kids go to and get off of school. I used to often settle and shop around where those kids are. And if it was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 8 o'clock in the morning, you would see on the trains who the Stuyvesant kids are. And almost definitely it is an ocean of Asian kids of various Asiannesses, and then also a whole lot of Indian kids, and too few black kids to even mention a sliver of white kids. But yes, it's an ocean of quote unquote yellow and South Asian brown. And the black kids are very, very rare. I saw that for several years running. And when you see the actual people in question, you get away from the statistics and all the stories about what happened in 1955. You just see the people. It is impossible to think that the reason for the racial composition of this school is that America doesn't like black kids. The reason is that these kids, and you can tell that almost none of them come from affluent circumstances. These kids' immigrant parents made fucking hell sure that their kids could take that stupid test. They worked at it in a way that our people's parents don't know how to do yet. And I think part of it is a sense of disidentification from the whole endeavor. But the reason is not residual racism and the fact that America doesn't care about black kids. And I am very disturbed by the way the media covers this, although I understand it, and I'm not sure I can reasonably expect all those editors and writers to tell what I'm sure they can tell the truth is, but they're not telling the truth.
You said something earlier I just wanted to underscore, which was this. I read the same report that in years, decades past, the numbers of African Americans matriculating at these schools was actually higher than it is now. And people attributed the difference. There was an op-ed piece, I think, in the New York Times by someone who has done research on peer effects, what they call peer effects, which is how quickly you learn and master the intellectual material to some degree depends upon who your peers are and whether or not they reinforce the learning process and so on. And with bright kids, so first of all, you have to admit some kids are brighter than others. Okay, a lot of people have a problem with that. Then you have to see that the bright kids have appropriate peers. That's what tracking does. That's what gifted and talented programs are. Then you have to celebrate and lionize the fact that some kids are actually excelling at the kind of thing that you're honoring by allowing them to go into gifted and talented programs. A little bit like what we would do if the person was a really good basketball player. If they were a really good basketball player at the age of 8 or 10 or 12 in the community, they would be celebrated and lionized. They're going to be playing, for Duke one day for Coach Smith or whoever it is, and they're going to be in the NBA and whatnot. We would be all getting all excited about that. Well, what about valorizing, celebrating, and honoring and making heroes out of and models for our kids, these smart, gifted, and talented youngsters who happen to be brown, and making sure from the very first step out of the gate, they get reinforced, they get celebrated, they get honored, they get resources, they get pushed. You too can get into Stuyvesant High School. You're 6 years old. My dream for you when you're 14 is that you're going to enroll as a freshman at Stuyvesant. And I'm going to do everything, and my community is going to reinforce it. And public resources could be brought to bear on that. But that is not happening. And I think that's what actually needs to happen if we want to get these numbers, and want to get these numbers up. And the numbers may never be parity. Why do they have to be parity? They're not parity in a lot of other avenues of life. Why do they have to be parity? Or flip the script. Suppose we were talking about who's going to get on the high school basketball team. And you had an underrepresentation of pick your group. Okay, they're not blacks, but pick your group. We got an underrepresentation of Chinese on the basketball team. Then we got to talk to the coach about how he's vetting people to get on the basketball team when we all know that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We all know that what matters is, can you put the ball through the hoop? Okay. It's not ordained anywhere that every group is going to be able to do that with equal facility for all kinds of cultural, historical, and other sociological reasons. So that's my last word on it.
That we have to talk about whether it's acceptable that Black people will be thought of as ones where, logical, mathematical intelligence is just not culturally what we do. That would be interesting. And I should just say, in some, that Clarence was a good athlete. He was feel cool. And so, here we are. All
right, Mr. Anecdote. I think that one's a wrap. Talk to you soon. Thanks for coming on the Glenn Show, John. Always a pleasure.
Definitely. I'll be back.
All right. So that is a wrap.